This is a big day since we're getting started with the heroes, and this is going to be the most important of the 4 days we deal with pre-Homeric heroes for the probably obvious reason that we are going to make a segue from gods to heroes. And so we're going to say a lot today, or at least a little, about heroes as a category, as opposed to only this one particular hero. Okay? And the way to kind of come to terms with that is, first of all, to remember we did an entire day about Egypt, an entire day about Mesopotamia. And I told you guys that the main reason for dealing with Egypt, for our purposes at least, was in order to get an idea of what sorts of ideas the Greeks might have gotten about the gods from others than the Greeks, okay, in this case the Egyptians, and the idea of a creation myth, the beginning of the universe, and where the gods come from, and also how the king of the gods became the king of the gods through the succession myth. And then I mentioned that the reason why, both in the chapter on Mesopotamia in the book and in the class, we deal with the whole day on Mesopotamia, it had to do with, as a kind of precursor to the Greek notion of heroes. Okay, so when we looked at Gilgamesh, it gave us a pretty good idea about what to expect when we get into heroes, especially the journey that Gilgamesh takes across the world in order to find out how to kind of bail out Utnapishtim from death. Okay? That was the idea behind dealing with Egypt and Mesopotamia, to give us a precedent for the Greeks, okay, when it comes to gods and heroes. And we're done with the gods per se. We're going to be having recourse to them for the rest of the semester because they always show up, especially in myth, but there's always references to them in everyday life as well. And now we move on to the heroes. So the obvious question to ask is how gods differ from heroes and vice versa, right? And the first thing to know about heroes is that they're known not only by the fact that they tend to, at least the ones who are talked about the most, to engage in famously difficult exploits and achieve them. But also, it's not only a matter of what they do, but it's also a matter of who they are. And just about all heroes, there are exceptions, as there usually are with things like this, but for the sake of a definition, you can think of a hero as someone who not only does important and difficult exploits, but also the fact that they have some amount of divine blood in them. Okay, that's the idea. Now, as we learned with Gilgamesh, having more than half divinity in him wasn't enough to keep him from having to die one day. So obviously, the idea is that no matter how much mortality you have in you, no matter how much of a human being you are going to die. So even theoretically, 1/1,000,000th human being, you would still have to die. Okay? And that's an important thing. And it should also keep us from getting too obsessed about how much divinity a given hero has. Okay? Unless they're related to each other. If you're speaking in relative terms, later on we'll see, when we get next time to Heracles, and then the day after that, when we get to Theseus, Heracles and Theseus, for reasons we'll get to later, I don't want to get too far off track from Perseus today, are pretty much 1 1/2. Theseus modeled as a kind of mini Heracles, as we'll see in many different ways, in interesting ways. Okay, give you first spoiler. Whereas Heracles performs 12 labors, Theseus performs 6. Okay, so there are lots of other very over-the-top, conspicuous examples of how it is that Theseus was portrayed as about half as great as Heracles for good reasons. Okay, for good reasons that are too interesting just to throw out today. So we'll hold off on that. But other than that, just know that the hero has some divinity in him, and the reason why it's not important to know is because this whole notion of a demigod, the whole notion of a hero who is half God, that's just a vast generalization. The Greeks didn't ever talk in those terms. Okay, they didn't talk in those terms. What terms they did talk in was they used Dios, D-I-O-S, or transliterated from Greek to Latin, which means divine. Okay, so if you have any divinity in you whatsoever, you can be referred to as Dios, or divine, whether you be Zeus, who is 100% divine, or, for example, Achilles, who is just about half divine. Okay? Another reason not to get too hung up on the label of demigod and having to parcel out exactly how much of a god a hero is that if you look at different genealogies, you'll see different things going on. There's different, you can't always account for where a given person in the lineage came from, and that person may very well have ancestors who go way, 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 way back that, to someone who was born to Zeus, and then there's a little bit more there, so it's a little more than half, or sometimes it's a little less than half if the person, you know what I'm saying. The other way would be just if there were a little less. So don't get too hung up on quantity. It's more a matter of quality. It's more a matter of distinguishing these things. Okay, so what is the purpose of the stories about where a universe comes from? In other words, why did we bother with Hesiod's theogony, the part of it that deals with creation myth, in order to understand why it was that human beings looked around themselves and wondered about where the things in the world came from, and in a way that we can relate to and that we can kind of internalize viscerally. We would wonder too. If we didn't have science, if we weren't born into a society where we're taught from close to the very beginning, if not in school, at least at home, where things come from, this and that. But in ancient Greece, you didn't know that, so you had to rely on those myths, in particular the theogony by Hesiod. Same thing goes with where the gods came from, okay, as far as the story that the Greeks depended on for that, and also why Zeus ultimately was the god who came out above all others and became the ruler of the Olympians. That's also known through the theogony. But then when you start asking about heroes, it's another story. There is not one main source that the Greeks relied on the way they did Hesiod's theogony in order to answer general things about heroes. That had to come through experience with all kinds of literary works that, first of all, there were a variety of them. It wasn't just one. But second of all, almost all of them are lost to us now. Okay, so there was no Homer or Hesiod of, for example, Perseus. Okay, so if you want to know about Zeus and all the other Olympians we talked about so far, go right to Hesiod and you're set. They're all accounted for eventually. If not that, some of the gods who were born later aren't, and then you get into Homer and they all show up, and by the time you read Hesiod and Homer, you have a good idea about the authority of those two authors when it comes to the gods. With the heroes, you don't. Okay, so what you have to do is you have to rely mainly on paraphrases of the works that we no longer possess. And if that weren't bad enough, paraphrases that were made, and what a paraphrase is, kind of an approximation of what the sources that we no longer possess said. Okay, say if you had to do that with Hesiod. Pretty much we did that in class, right? We did kind of a paraphrase of it. We couldn't read the original. Well, when it comes to the heroes we're dealing with next, the four heroes, the four pre-Homeric heroes, starting with Perseus, we have to, for the most part, depend on epitomes, is another word for it, or paraphrases, of very late sources from the Hellenistic period. And what that means is sources that are as distant from the original sources as we are from the founding fathers of the U.S. Okay, to get, I always like to get historical perspective chronologically. Okay, so hundreds of years away from the original sources. So like a game of operator where there's one message on a line of, say, 20, 30 people, and by the end, what the last person says, the first person said, is not even close to what the first person says. Nobody knows for sure how close what we learn about these heroes comes to what the original sources that we no longer possess said about them. And so we do our best. Okay, it's more of the same of that kind of stuff we were talking about before in terms of doing the best we can with the limited sources we have. Okay? But that being said, there are certain parallels between the different heroes that are worth pointing out, that are illuminative about the individual heroes, and also that have been exploited by modern thinkers as well, guys like Freud, Joseph Campbell, and before Campbell, Jung, Freud's student. You have all kinds of modern thinkers who use myth as ways to help explain what are believed to be structures of the psyche, of the human mind, that are common to what the mind was like back in the days when these heroes were being written about by these writers who were thought of, or are thought of, as having had extremely deep insight into the human psyche. And that's why guys like Freud, it's not just a matter of being nice to the ancients when a guy like Freud brings, say, Oedipus the king, into his talking, or Electra, into his talking about what's going on in the psyche. It's because the ancient Greeks, just as we talked about with Nietzsche, the philosopher Nietzsche, were thought of as having discovered some very deep things about the human psyche that are worthwhile to pay attention to and to resurrect and include in modern thinking about things as well. Okay? And it's especially true with heroes, for the very big reason that we're now going to get into. We're going to get into this idea. A hero not only differs from a god in the sense that he has some divinity in him rather than all divinity, but probably the most important difference between gods and heroes is that, what do you think? Is there something that on a kind of visceral level you have a sense that, I almost don't want to give it away by getting deeper into the question. Just off the top of your head, is there something about heroes that now that we're going to start talking about heroes, maybe even in this room, there might be almost a sense of relief? You know what I mean? Does that give you a hint? At least this is the perception about the difference between thinking about gods and thinking about heroes. You know what I'm talking about here? I'll give you a hint. Why did we end talking about the Olympians with the earth gods, hint, 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 Demeter and Dionysus? Relatable, all right? That's it. That's what it all has to do with. The earth deities are the segue, are the halfway point, in a way, between the more rarefied sky-type gods in Olympus and the earth deities, Dionysus and Demeter, okay? So relatability is what it's all about, the sense that human beings have something to learn in a more or less direct way from Dionysus and Demeter, and even more so from the heroes. Now, why more so from the heroes? For the obvious reason that they are susceptible to the very thing that we too are, and that is death. It's 100%. That's what it has to do with. And I think I told you from day one in this class that, probably not surprisingly, mythology is obsessed. If there's any one thing it's obsessed with, it's mortality. You would not have myth without mortality. Okay? You wouldn't have it. You wouldn't have any reason for it. Right? Because, hey, you don't have to die. You don't have. That's really what it comes down to. It sounds simplistic, but there's no exceptions to it. And so when we look at the different heroes, in the backdrop of every story is this idea, how's he going to die? Right? And what does he accomplish before he dies? What is it that makes him legitimately considered a hero? Right? And then they differ. And so we'll stick with the first four here that we're dealing with. Okay? They differ. Heracles is considered a legitimate hero in a different way than Perseus is, in a different way than Theseus, different way from Jason. Okay? So they're very different heroes, yet they all have pretty much one thing in common, and that is, not just one thing, but a kind of series of things in common, and that is they have to die, so there's that end game, that they're going to die one day, but then on the way there, they go on a more or less what we would call hero quest. Okay? And it's from that determination, for whatever reason, sometimes a trivial reason, sometimes a less trivial reason, that they're going to go on that quest to their attainment of it, and then usually they become a king of some place, an important place that serves them for the rest of their lives. And that is another segue into an important aspect of heroes. Think about it. Why do you need heroes? Why do you need to, let's be a little bit cynical here, why do you need to invent heroes? You're telling these stories, you're in power, and you're telling these stories, inventing them even. Who is the audience? The audience is the people, right? And the people are the ones being ruled. In Egypt, it was enough to call the pharaoh/king a god, okay? And the people, to put it straightforward in a neutral way, went for it, okay? Agreed with that, okay? The pharaoh equals a god, was a god. Forget about was a hero, forget about was something like a god, was the embodiment of the sun god Ra. In Greece, it required a little more finessing. No one who ruled claimed to be a god. That came in Rome. That was in Rome. We got a little bit of that going with some Roman emperors. That had to do with legitimizing the emperor by connecting the emperor to a god from ancient Greece. And that did happen, okay? Whether it be Mars, whether it be Jupiter, whatever. But in Greece, it was the heroes that served as the intermediary, the mediating stage between gods and the people. The idea was that those who were in power in the various population centers of ancient Greece in the prehistoric and the archaic periods. So we're talking in prehistory, the three-pronged part of prehistory, and then the first of three parts of Greek history per se, the archaic. In those periods, those 4 out of 6 periods of ancient Greek history, those in power didn't call themselves gods, but they claimed, quite often, not always, to have divinity in them, to have divine blood, to actually have a lineage that goes back to Zeus, goes back to Poseidon, but especially Zeus. Why? Because as you'll see, all the heroes that we'll be dealing with, except for Theseus, has Zeus blood. Theseus has Poseidon blood. Okay? So in other words, the kings modeled themselves on the very heroes that they convinced the people to worship, no differently than they worshipped the gods, in order to legitimate themselves as being, this is just straight out in the history books. I'm making a big deal out of it. The history books just say it. You know, they say, he claimed to have whatever blood. Oh, are we going to say any more about that? You know, I mean, what if our president said that? We'd be like, oh, really? Okay. So this was stuff that was taken for granted. And so to associate yourself with the gods by, in effect, calling yourself a hero, right? Because that's what is a hero, is someone who has the divine blood and does great, great things. So insofar as they were considered on a political level to have done great things, which how do you prove yourself that you've done great things? Militarily. How do you prove yourself militarily unless you have wars? How do you have wars unless you can convince people that they've got to fight in order to prove themselves on the battlefield? The most conspicuous one being the one who takes all the credit for winning the war, the one in power. Are you connecting all this? Right? Okay, so that it's important for us to understand all this before we jump into the more abstract, rarefied, entertaining, fun, superhero-derived topic of heroes. This stuff has very real-world relevance, and that's why I begin every class I teach that deals with ancient Greek culture with mythology. So Perseus is the very first of the Greek heroes. In the way that Gilgamesh was the very first world hero, Perseus was the first Greek hero, the very first of them. This idea of a hero being a hybrid creature in a pull the camera away broader sense than divine, not divine, came from even further back than the very notion of heroes. Don't forget, Zeus, when he was given birth to on the island of Crete in order to prevent being swallowed up by Cronus the way his siblings had been, was raised on the island of Crete by a centaur, okay, by a half horse, half man, with the, very importantly, the man part on top. The head was man. The bottom part was horse. Now, there's lots of arguing about the symbolism of that, but it's very obvious that that's different than the Minotaur, which we'll talk about when we get to Theseus, being half bull, half man, with the bull part on the top. That means bad. That means monster. That means opposite of human. That means opposite of cultivated and cultured. Okay? Within the ancient Greek context I'm talking about. All right? Whereas a centaur, you'll see Alexander the Great, supposedly, when he's mythologized, was supposedly raised to some extent by a centaur in the historical period. It's not the only, Jason, Zeus himself, as we just said. So this idea of centaurs being considered legitimate cultural agents, tutors of some of the greatest figures in mythology, and even in the case of Alexander the Great in history, is something we need to understand and remember when we contextualize the hero. There were others. The satyr, okay? They were part goat, part human, and they were considered to be more along the lines of the Minotaur in the sense of being not mean and horrible and vicious and dangerous like the Minotaur, but animalistic rather than humanistic, okay? And so the satyr, the goat man running around with Pan, the most famous of them, running around the woods, panicking people. That's where the word panic comes from. And so the hero is only the last in a long line of hybrid creatures that combine, in this case, divine and mortal. All right, so here's an aspect of the various heroes. And remember, just so you have an outline in your head, the next 4 days, including this one, we're going to be dealing with 4 different heroes. And it's not like I picked them out of the blue. These are by far the 4 most important heroes that the Greeks worshipped and told stories about, another way of saying made a big deal out of, before the Homeric epics came along. Once the Homeric epics came along, which is pretty much the apex of this class, we're leading up to that, hence the name of the book, by the way, then all kinds of new heroes come along that are kind of more worldly and heroes of the type that we might associate more often these days with something, with the idea of the hero that we think of these days. But there is an important distinction to make between the 4 pre-Homeric heroes we'll be looking at, starting with Perseus, and then the Homeric ones we'll be on. So remember that distinction, okay? So it's an important thing for us to remember when we think of Zeus, the first thing we think of, as far as being able to recognize him besides his beard, is the thunderbolt and maybe the eagle, one or the other, okay? So you think of him with the thunderbolt. The thunderbolt is his weapon. The thunderbolt is a weapon that he uses in order to cause destruction or exact punishment or something like that. Same thing with the trident and Poseidon. Definitely a direct parallel with Zeus's thunderbolt. Think of Hermes, it's a little trickier. You think of his caduceus, you think of that staff he holds, and or his winged sandals, and or his winged helmet. But with all 3 of those, it's impossible to recognize him as someone other than who he is. You recognize him? So far, we have 3 gods, and so far we have a bunch of objects associated with them. Okay, things they use. Tools is a good word for it. Equipment, right? Tools that they use to do what they do. Same thing with Athena. You think of her with the helmet. You think of her with the spear. Those are the 2 main things. Every once in a while, there will be some animals, like a snake or something. Same thing with Demeter, by the way. But that's not, if you had nothing there but the snake, and her without the helmet, and her without the spear, and she were in some kind of artwork, whether it be a sculpture, whether it be a vase that she's painted on, you would have to actually do something in order to identify her, because you wouldn't recognize her without the spear or the helmet. What do you think it would be? What would you have to do in order for the audience to know that it's Athena? On an artwork, you would have to spell it out. Today I ran across an artwork that had Athena in it with Perseus, and Athena was standing behind Perseus, but she didn't have her helmet, she didn't have her spear. Maybe the artist was lazy, maybe the artist couldn't draw a good helmet, whatever. There she was standing there. How the hell did you know it was her? Because it was written. It said Athena. All right, so that's how you have to do it. So that's how important these tools are that we associate, at least the most important of the deities with. Same thing with Apollo, the bow and arrow, or the harp. We talked about the ambiguity there, the fact that he's both the guy who shoots arrows at people to cause plagues, to retaliate against things that they do they shouldn't do, and or you have the harp, the equivalent of the harp, the lyre, that represents his function as a patron of the arts, along with the muses that he hangs out with. Artemis, bow and arrow just like her bro, that less ambiguously and more inevitably. So you have the bow and arrow for her, the goddess of the animals, the wild animals. Now we got Perseus. Do you guys know what you think of right away when you think of Perseus? How you know that it's Perseus? You don't have any particular victim of Zeus that he's holding. You don't have any particular victim of Apollo's wrathful arrows that he shoots at, or any victim of the spear of Athena. With the gods, there's lots of debate about why it is that the gods are known primarily by the things they use rather than those they conquer. For one thing, it has to do with the fact that there's so many stories about the gods conquering different victims that it's hard to pick one. There's just because there's so many. But there's a little more to it than that. Okay? And when we deal with each of the heroes, starting with Perseus that we'll be looking at, notice that all of them have this in common. Perseus, Heracles, Theseus, and Jason all have in common. What's going on here? Why this one particular creature, the dead head of Medusa? Why is she the thing that her head is a thing, right? Why is that the one thing we think of right away, immediately, no less so than when we think of the trident of Poseidon? It all has to do with the fact that unlike Zeus, who's all over the place, doing all kinds of things, always called on by any number of people, and all these other gods, they're all over the place. They are thought of as using their tools in order to bring about whatever human beings pray to them to bring about, as long as they do so in a reverent enough way and sacrifice properly and this and that. Whereas when you get to each of these heroes, things are a lot more unambiguous and a lot more monolithic. Perseus, in effect, equals the Medusa killer. right? Zeus doesn't equal the blank killer. Anybody he's ever killed, or Apollo, or Athena, they are never known. Homer calls Hermes Argiophontes, which means the killer of Argos. He has that nickname. That's kind of an exception, but that's not a picture. You don't see Hermes with a picture of Argos as the identifier of who he is, okay? So it's still consistent. When you're dealing with Perseus, you're dealing with this one decapitated Gorgon, because that represents his end game. That represents the goal at the end of his hero quest, the raison d'etre, reason of being for the hero, is as an example of a partially human being like us setting out to achieve a goal and achieving it. A kind of more touchy-feely way of saying that is that once you get into hero stories, you get into the realm of what used to be called self-help or self-improvement. If you go to the bookstore near the psychology section, the self-improvement section, this idea of looking up to heroes as examples of what we human beings who don't have divinity in us but also have in common with the heroes a lack of divinity, as an example for us to think of our lives as having maybe one main quest that we set out to achieve. Okay, so look at to them as inspirations for our own lives. Throughout various sources in the ancient world, there is this sense of heroes having the function of being models, paradigms for behavior, for us to look up to in order to achieve what we have to do. So for example, if you're a musician and you want to kick ass in the music world, that's your one giant passion, that's your one obsession, and you know you're going to do it, and you're not going to say no, and you're going to die trying, and if it doesn't work, that's fine. At least you've lived out your thing. That's your Medusa. Got me? That's what heroes have to do with. Models for that. Before you had heroes, you didn't have that. Zeus doesn't have a Medusa. Apollo doesn't have a Medusa. Dionysus doesn't have a Medusa. It's kind of interesting, right? And it all comes down to the fact that the gods are too rarefied. They're too out there. They're too different from us, except for Dionysus and Demeter to some extent, for us to be able to relate to enough to see them as models for our own behavior. Okay, so let's do what we did with the Gilgamesh story and kind of go through the most important details of the Perseus story, if nothing else, to demystify it so you don't feel like it's as much a bunch of details to memorize as you realize, it's just very... First of all of these hero myths, these pre-Homeric hero myths, are modeled very conspicuously on the myths from Hesiod's theogony of the first entities and deities in the universe. So don't forget, Uranus found out from the oracle at Delphi that he was going to be deposed by his own son. And then Cronus found out that he was going to be deposed, and Zeus found out he was going to be deposed. All of them from the oracle at Delphi. So all of these hero stories we are dealing with coming up begin with an oracle. So there are lots of details that are similar between the hero stories and the god stories, the gods and goddesses stories. Okay, so Acrisius, and don't worry about spelling, because if you're... The reason why you have a C here, sometimes you see a K instead. It depends on whether you're taking the spelling from Greek or from Latin. Okay, so Acrisius begins it all. Okay, Acrisius is a king of Argos, which you should think of in connection with Mycenae and with Pylos and all the other and even Knossos down in Crete. Think of as one of the major prehistoric Greek population centers, a settlement that was very big, and you could still visit today and see the ruins of. Okay, so Argos is one step away from saying Mycenae. Okay, a very big place, very important place in prehistory, and this is the king. And the king has a daughter, but of course he knows that in order to be able to pass on his power as king to a child, the child needs to be male. He's unable to have a male child. So he goes to the oracle at Delphi to find out whether he's going to ever have a male child. And then he finds out from the oracle that kind of yes, kind of no. You yourself are not going to have a male child. Your daughter is. But the catch is, he's going to ice you and take over your power. Hello, right? Now, right away, we should be reminded of Uranus and Cronus and Zeus. That's why it's so important for us to have taken all the time we did on the succession myth in the theogony, because it's so archetypal when it comes to these other, in this case, hero stories. So your daughter's going to have a child, but he's going to overtake you. So this is the first moment in hero myth in ancient Greece, which I like to think of as an iconic moment, a moment that, for whatever reason, throughout the ages, artists of various media, whether it be painters, sculptors, writers, considered this moment to be an important enough moment to encapsulate in their artworks. And so you have lots of, in this case, paintings of the fact that Perseus creates this chamber, kind of tower, above a building. She's imprisoned in it, so she can't have the child that Perseus finds out from the oracle, if she has, will overtake him. So he tries to prevent her from having a kid by locking her up, in effect in a dungeon, just a horrible thing. Imprisons her. There's some kind of portal, or a window of some kind, in this room, through which Zeus looks and sees her and falls in lust/love. Who knows what. Okay? And get ready for this, because not only are the rest of the Olympians, after the first brood in the theogony, children of Zeus, but all of the heroes that we're going to be looking at, except for Theseus, who is the child of Poseidon, and that has a lot to do with the fact that Theseus is considered to be a kind of mini Heracles, and so those who came up with Theseus wanted to differentiate him from Heracles, and so it makes a lot of sense that his father would be different than Zeus. So there's a kind of forced reason for him being different from Zeus. But other than that, think of Zeus above all, as the one that has the kids, who are the most important kids, whether it be heroes or other Olympians. And this is no exception. So Zeus looks through this portal, sees Danae. Okay, so I'm not going to cry wolf with names, okay, when it comes to these stories. Perseus is important. Danae is important. And then obviously the child that Zeus and she are going to conceive is important, Perseus. Okay, so there's going to be important names. So through this portal, Zeus rains gold on her, and that is the iconic moment where artists have really gotten into depicting it in various ways. And along the lines of this idea of how the iconography of these myths changes throughout history, reflecting different societies, comes the idea that in the Renaissance and after, this gold was often portrayed as coins, as gold coins. So lots of depictions of this moment, because this is the beginning of, for the Greeks, the very embodiment of the hero. Okay, it's this moment of Zeus meeting up with Danae, who's imprisoned by her father, so she doesn't have a kid, just like Zeus's grandfather tried to prevent his father from being born, and it's all connected. Cronus and Uranus. So here we have the beginning of the birth of the very first of the Greek heroes, or at least the conception. Lots and lots of depictions of that. And that's the conception of Perseus. At first, everything's cool. The baby is born in this chamber that Danae is locked in. But then one day, Perseus hears the baby cry. And then the second big moment of this story occurs. And as you could probably guess, because it's such an important story, this moment is also depicted by artists throughout the ages quite often. And that is, Perseus takes it to the next level. He takes his daughter and her kid through Zeus, not believing that Zeus is the father. She does all she can to convince him that Zeus is the father. Perseus doesn't believe it. Perseus throws them into a chest, a wooden chest, and casts them out to sea, assuming they're going to die. That should remind you of the Osiris, Seth motif in the Heliopolis creation myth. Look back at that if you need reminding of that. Okay, this is not a coincidence. Apparently, this first hero of the Greeks, the story of him was inspired by, or at least influenced by, the Heliopolis creation myth, the aspect of the chest, Osiris being thrown into a chest and cast out to the water and expected to die. Lots of depictions of this. And here, you have Danae washing up to shore on an island called Seriphos. Even though the island itself is fairly obscure in the ancient world, just like Chios for Homer, as we'll see, it's best known as the island on which Perseus washed up. Okay, it never really got any historical importance. So yeah, the name is important, Seriphos, but the location isn't. It's one of hundreds and hundreds of Greek islands. And this is Danae handing the baby Perseus to Dictys. Okay, so Dictys finds them on the shore. Dictys is the fisherman who is the brother of the king, very symbolically. And the name of the king that Dictys is the brother of and will eventually have to give up Perseus to is named Polydectes. Now, this is a bunch of names, and it's a pain in the ass to remember names unless you make some kinds of connections. I think you might be happy to know that the two most difficult names here to remember are related to each other. Dictys and Polydectes. As we'll see later in the story, very ironically, the king, Polydectes, his name means better than Dictys. It's kind of amazing, okay? Dectes, Dictys, same exact root, okay? It means, poly means much, many, or implied better, okay? A many Dictys, the opposite of a mini Heracles, or a mini me, that kind of thing, okay? So that's going to come in important later because, spoiler, unless you've done the reading, in which case you already know this, Dictys is going to eventually become the king. He's going to overtake Polydectes. So not too many characters to learn, but it's an important enough story for us to remember these names. So Dictys raises Perseus on this island of Seriphos. So here's the deal. The older Perseus gets, the more Polydectes, the king, falls in whatever, love or lust, with Danae. But the problem is, the older Perseus gets, the more obvious it is that he's becoming a formidable obstacle to the king, to prevent him from going after his mother. Polydectes comes up with a sham wedding, invites everybody but Perseus to the pre-wedding meeting, and tells them all what gift to bring him. Perseus shows up along with everybody else to the wedding without a gift because he didn't know about the meeting. Polydectes says, oh yeah, likely story, you better make up for that or I'm going to kill you. And then Perseus comes up with, or Polydectes assigns to him the task of going and killing the Gorgon Medusa. But the reason why Perseus goes on the quest is not nearly as important as the fact that he does go out on the quest and that he does, spoiler, achieve his goal. Okay, so he's a hero who has a goal, goes out to achieve it, does all that he needs to do along the way, which includes, very important point to make, when we get on to Odysseus in Homer, we'll see that at first he thinks he doesn't need it, but Perseus from the very beginning knows he needs the help of the gods in order to achieve his ultimate goal, to kill Medusa. Okay? And that's where you get those details from this point on. The idea that Perseus learns that he needs to go, first of all, to sisters of Medusa to find out what? To find out where somebody else is, who you then have to ask directly, what does he need to do in order to achieve his goal successfully? And what's the big deal about this goal? Medusa, I think we all know, if you look at her, you turn to stone. So how the heck is Perseus going to achieve this? What is he going to have to do? How is he going to get to the other end of the earth in order to find Medusa? That's another problem. So he goes to these sisters of Medusa called the Graii, older women who are blind, who don't have any eyes in their head, and don't have any teeth in their mouth, and they share one eye and one tooth between them. Okay, they pass it around. So what Perseus does is he grabs the eye and the teeth from them and says that until they tell him what he needs to know, he's not giving it back to them. So they do. They tell him where he needs to go in order to find the nymphs of the sea who have the answers that he needs in order to achieve his goal. He finds out where to go to find them, and he does. He asks the nymphs what to do, and the nymphs have learned from Athena that what he needs to do is borrow from the Olympian gods certain, here we go again, tools, equipment from the gods. And the ones that are most common in the many, many different variations of this story are the helmet of invisibility from Hades. So Hades has a helmet of invisibility, which reflects the fact that his first name in ancient Greek meant the invisible one. He also needs to get the winged boots of Hermes in order to fly to wherever he needs to go to in order to find Medusa. And then finally he needs to get a sack that he brings in order to put the head of Medusa into after he decapitates her, called the kibisis. And then finally is the third stage. So we have three stages. The Graii, the nymphs, and then finding Medusa herself. Sounds familiar? 3 stages. The succession myth. When you're dealing with the gods, this is not a coincidence. 3-part arc of a drama. Ever hear of that? 3 parts. Look at Shakespeare. 3 parts. There's something about it. It gained traction in narratives. Okay, so now Perseus needs to find the Gorgons in general, but then Medusa in particular. And then the one thing Perseus didn't get help from the gods in determining was how the heck he's going to end up killing Medusa once he finds her. He needed to find out where the figures who would tell him what he needed to get to Medusa would be. He does that successfully, but then once he's there, the hell do I do? No one tells him what to do. He's a hero. He needs to engage himself and his intelligence to some extent in order to be a legitimate hero. When you're a hero, you don't have anybody tell you everything you need to do, because then you're nothing but a puppet. Okay? So he had to have the ingenuity to figure out how to kill Medusa on his own. And there is a very important distinguishing trait between the things that can be told to a hero and the things that can't. Lots and lots of hints can be given in the way of information, an oracle, for example. Lots of help can be provided in the way of, for example, when we get to Homer, favorable winds to get the Greeks to Troy in order to fight the war. But when it comes down to it, when it comes to the ultimate achievement of the goal, in and of itself, that is associated with the iconography, the imagery associated with the hero, in this case, the head of Medusa, that final act that turns the guy with divine blood into a full-fledged hero needs to come from his own intelligence. And that's going to be very conspicuous when we get to the next guy, Heracles. Okay, we're going to see that the various labors he goes on involve his intellect in different ways. And you'll see that Disney didn't quite do much service to our boy Heracles. There's no sense of him being kind of a frivolous, laughing-stockish kind of guy. I mean, if anything, there was a kind of ominous fear associated with the idea of Heracles. You know, he was worshipped in a very serious way. He was a very serious hero, not a kind of funny guy like a Hermes. Okay, there was not much of a jokester notion to Heracles at all. I mean, if anything, a horribly tragic overtone to Heracles for reasons we'll get into when we get to him. So in this case, Perseus achieves what he does by the ingenuity of coming up with the idea of looking at Medusa not straight on, because he'll be turned into stone right away, but rather indirectly by looking at her through the reflection on the shield, and then in one way or another managing to calculate the trajectory of the throw of his sword, that he manages to throw as a projectile and to stab her face enough to where he can use the reflection, continue to use it to where he gets up to her, grabs the sword, and then starts stabbing her, and then decapitates her, puts her head in the kidneys, all without looking at her. He didn't learn any of that from Athena, from Hermes, from the Graiai, from the nymphs. That's all him. He came up with that. Okay? And it's important to know that, because that's another thing in common between these different heroes we'll be looking at. Moving on even into the Homeric realm. And then from the decapitated head of Medusa, once he cuts it off, come 2 figures, the most famous being Pegasus, the cute winged horse. Then there's also the giant Chrysaor, who doesn't have much press in mythology at all. Just think of him as a giant, which makes sense, because we're talking about Medusa, the Gorgon, the snaky-headed creature. But the focus for us is on this hero and the fact that he accomplished this goal by his own ingenuity, despite having to rely on help from the gods. And when we get to Odysseus, we're going to see an example of a hero who isn't able to achieve what he does until he admits his need of help from the gods. Okay, before that, he brags that he doesn't need any more help because of his success up to that point. Trojan horse. Now Perseus flies away. For the last time he gets to use these cool sandals of Hermes. Flies away, and on the way back to Seriphus in order to deliver the package, still believing that Acrisius the king is a decent dude, what he'll turn out not to be. On the way there, he sees a distressed maiden. His wife-to-be is the one that he spots being sacrificed to a sea monster. And it's the same name used by Melville to refer to the whale, Moby Dick, at the beginning, when there's all those quotes about whales. kind of interesting, a little parallel there. So Andromeda is her name, and she's being sacrificed mainly because of something stupid that her mother did when she was bragging about being more beautiful than some divinities. But for all our purposes, the key here is that Perseus saves her from a sea monster and pretty much saves the people. They say, okay, she doesn't need to be sacrificed for the errors of her mother, bragging about how much better she is than the gods. If you kill the sea monster, you can take her as your wife, and he does that. And he takes Andromeda back with him to Seriphos. And once he gets to Seriphos, he learns, to his chagrin, that Polydectes isn't the good guy that he hoped he was, but that rather when Perseus was out achieving his hero quest, Perseus did all he could to convince Danae that it was in her best interest to be the queen of Seriphos. She didn't like him, though. Okay? She didn't accept his overtures. And so when Perseus gets to Seriphos and finds this out, he exposes, without looking at it and telling everybody he cared about not to look at it, Medusa's head from the kibbasis, holds it up to Polydectes. Polydectes turns him to stone, and from that point on, Dictys, the fisherman, his brother, became the king. So Dictys, the fisherman, Polydectes, better than Dictys, turns to stone, is no longer the king, and now the guy that was supposedly not as good as the king becomes the new king. The last part of the story is very simple, and that is that Perseus becomes the founder of pretty much the most important, or at least one of the two most important prehistoric Greek settlements. Okay, Mycenae. The very place where Agamemnon, the king who rules over the other kings who go to Troy in the Trojan War, is from and is king of. Okay, so we have that nice little connection between the Perseus story and the story of the Trojan War that Homer was singing about in his Iliad. Okay, so the last thing here is that's the connection. The settlement of Mycenae is the connection between the world of the pre-Homeric heroes and the world of the Homeric heroes who fought in the Trojan War in the Mycenaean period. Next time we move on to Heracles, by far the most important of the Greek heroes. So Perseus is the first, but by no means the most important. Heracles is way the most important, and we'll talk about why.